The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranger training facility as Amanda Walker handed over another breakfast sandwich to a uniformed officer. At 26, with flour-dusted hands and an apron tied around her small frame, she looked like any other food truck owner trying to make ends meet. But what the elite rangers didn't know was that the young European woman serving their coffee could outshoot every single one of them. They saw her as invisible, just the girl who made their sandwiches. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. They had no idea that in less than 48 hours, she would prove that precision isn't about size, rank, or reputation. It's about preparation meeting opportunity, and Amanda had been preparing for a moment like this her entire life. Amanda Walker had been serving coffee and breakfast sandwiches to the Colorado Mountain Rangers for 8 months, and she was still invisible. Her small white food truck, Walker's Way, sat parked outside the elite training facility every morning at 5:30 a.m. sharp, ready to fuel the most skilled law enforcement officers in the region. The Rangers were legends, mountain rescue specialists, tactical experts, and sharpshooters who operated in terrain that would break ordinary people. At first glance, Amanda seemed like an unlikely entrepreneur, standing barely 5 feet 3 inches with auburn hair perpetually escaping from her ponytail. She spoke with a soft Austrian accent that made the tough Rangers smile despite themselves. Her truck served simple fare, breakfast burritos, fresh coffee, homemade pastries, but everything was prepared with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Every ingredient measured exactly, every order remembered perfectly, every customer interaction conducted with quiet efficiency. The Rangers had grown fond of her in the way people appreciate reliable service. They called her Walker like she was one of the team, though none of them knew anything about her beyond her nationality and her impeccable breakfast schedule. She was Swiss clockwork reliable, always friendly, and she never asked questions about their work. Perfect for a group of professionals who valued discretion above all else. What they didn't see were the details that mattered. They didn't notice how Amanda's eyes tracked every piece of equipment they carried, how she could identify firearm models from 100 yards away, or how her questions about their training were always perfectly casual but remarkably informed. They didn't see her apartment, where ballistics textbooks sat beside cookbooks, or her basement, where she'd built a shooting simulator using military-grade software that most Rangers had never heard of. Amanda had immigrated to Colorado 3 years earlier with dreams of opening a restaurant, but those dreams had collided with the harsh reality of startup costs and commercial real estate. The food truck had been a compromise, a way to build capital while she figured out her next move. What she hadn't expected was how much she'd come to love the routine, the independence, and especially the proximity to the Rangers. Every morning, she watched them prepare for operations that most people couldn't imagine, search and rescue missions in terrain where a single mistake meant death, tactical operations against armed fugitives hiding in mountain caves, precision shooting challenges where targets were measured in fractions of inches at distances that made grown men nervous. She watched, she learned, and she remembered everything. The Rangers operated out of a facility that looked more like a small military base than a law enforcement station. Multiple buildings housed their specialized equipment, from helicopters to armored vehicles to weapons that cost more than most people's cars. The shooting range was a marvel of engineering, capable of simulating any environment from dense forest to urban rooftops. Amanda had never been inside, of course. Civilians weren't allowed beyond the parking area where she set up her truck. But she didn't need to go inside to understand what was happening. Sound carried in the mountain air, and Amanda had developed an ear for the different types of training. Morning precision drills sounded different from tactical scenarios. Competition practice had a different rhythm than qualification tests. Over 8 months, she'd learned to read the facility's mood just by listening to the pattern of gunfire echoing off the surrounding peaks. The Rangers themselves were exactly what central casting would order for elite law enforcement. Tall, fit, confident men who moved with the easy grace of people accustomed to physical challenges. They wore their competence like expensive cologne, impossible to miss and slightly overwhelming to anyone who wasn't used to being around genuine experts. They were professionals in every sense of the word, and they expected the people around them to know their place in the hierarchy. Amanda knew her place. She was the food truck lady, the civilian who made their mornings a little more convenient. She was background scenery, as forgettable as the mountains that surrounded the facility, which was exactly how she preferred it, because invisibility had always been her greatest asset. None of them suspected that she'd grown up on a farm outside Salzburg, where her grandfather had taught her to shoot before she could properly ride a bicycle. None of them knew about the regional championships she'd won as a teenager, or the Olympic development program she'd left behind when family circumstances forced her to focus on more practical concerns. They didn't know about the thousands of hours she'd spent perfecting techniques that turned shooting from a skill into an art form. Most importantly, they didn't know that she'd been studying them. Every morning, as she served coffee and took orders, Amanda was conducting reconnaissance that would have impressed their tactical instructors. She knew which rangers favored which weapons, understood their individual strengths and weaknesses, and had formed detailed opinions about their techniques based on nothing more than observation and educated guessing. As she cleaned her truck at the end of another ordinary Tuesday morning, Amanda looked up at the facility's main building and wondered what it would be like to train alongside these men, to test her skills against the best law enforcement had to offer, to prove that precision shooting wasn't about intimidation or reputation, but about the marriage of mental discipline and physical technique that she'd been perfecting in private for years. It was a ridiculous fantasy, of course. She was just the food truck owner, and they were elite rangers. But as she locked up her truck and headed home to another evening of solitary practice in her basement, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, she'd get her chance to show them what real precision looked like. The conversation Amanda overheard that morning changed everything, though she gave no sign that she was listening. She was refilling the coffee dispensers when Ranger Captain Mike Torres approached her truck with two of his senior officers, their voices carrying the casual confidence of men who'd never been challenged by anyone they considered beneath their notice. "The quarterly assessment is next week," Torres was saying to Ranger Davis, a lean man with prematurely gray temples who served as the unit's primary marksmanship instructor. "Corporate's sending those consultants again to evaluate our training protocols." "Waste of time," Davis replied, accepting his usual black coffee from Amanda with barely a glance. "Some desk jockey with an MBA is going to tell us how to improve our shooting scores. As if civilian contractors understand the first thing about tactical precision." The third officer, Ranger Coleman, laughed as he grabbed a breakfast burrito. "Remember last year when that consultant suggested we try, quote, alternative training methods? Wanted us to learn from competitive shooters instead of focusing on tactical applications. Like sport shooting has anything to do with real-world scenarios." Amanda's hand paused for just a moment as she wiped down the counter, but none of the rangers noticed. They were too absorbed in their discussion to pay attention to the food truck owner, who might as well have been part of the equipment. "The problem," Torres continued, "is that these evaluations always focus on precision metrics that don't reflect operational reality. They want to see tight groupings at the range, but they don't understand that combat shooting is about speed, stress management, and tactical awareness. Civilian marksmen might be able to hit paper targets all day, but they'd fall apart the moment real pressure was applied." "Exactly," Davis agreed. "I've seen plenty of competition shooters who look impressive in controlled environments but can't adapt to dynamic situations. They're too focused on perfect form and ideal conditions. Real tactical shooting requires a different mindset entirely." Amanda continued her work, her movements steady and professional, while internally cataloging every word. These men had just dismissed an entire category of expertise without understanding what they were rejecting. They saw civilian shooting as somehow lesser, as if the skills that created Olympic champions and world record holders had no application to their work. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years developing exactly the kind of precision they were dismissing, but she'd also studied tactical applications extensively. Her basement training included stress scenarios, low light conditions, and rapid target acquisition drills that would have challenged any of these rangers. But because she wasn't wearing a uniform, because she served coffee instead of carrying a badge, her potential expertise was invisible to them. "The real issue," Coleman added, "is that these consultants always want to bring in outsiders to demonstrate, quote, innovative techniques. Last facility I worked at, they brought in some former military sniper who'd gone civilian. Guy thought his credentials entitled him to critique our methods. Took about 5 minutes of tactical scenarios to prove that civilian shooting experience doesn't translate to law enforcement applications." Torres nodded approvingly. "That's why I'm grateful we don't have to deal with that nonsense here. Our team knows what works, and we stick to proven methods. No room for experimentation when lives are on the line." As the Rangers walked away, discussing training schedules and equipment updates, Amanda felt the familiar burn of being underestimated. But this time, it was different. This time, she understood exactly how deep their assumptions ran. They didn't just see her as irrelevant, they'd dismiss her entire skill set as fundamentally incompatible with their world. Later that morning, while restocking supplies in her truck, Amanda overheard another conversation that crystallized her understanding of how the Rangers viewed outsiders. Two junior officers were discussing a recent training exercise where a civilian consultant had been brought in to evaluate their equipment. "Guy spent 2 hours explaining the ballistics of our rifles," one was saying, "like we haven't been using them for years. Then he starts suggesting modifications based on competitive shooting standards. Clearly had no idea what our operational requirements actually are." "That's the problem with civilians," his partner replied. "They think shooting is just about accuracy and consistency. They don't understand that we need weapons and techniques that work when everything's going wrong. When you're exhausted, scared, and operating in conditions that would shut down any civilian range." Amanda bit back a smile. If these officers only knew that she'd spent years training specifically for those conditions, that her basement contained equipment designed to simulate exactly the kind of stress and environmental factors they were describing, but their assumptions were so complete, so unexamined, that the possibility of civilian expertise never entered their consideration. The dismissal extended beyond shooting skills to broader questions of capability and judgment. Over the following days, Amanda noticed how conversations changed when civilian contractors or consultants were mentioned. The Rangers spoke about them with a mixture of condescension and irritation, as if outside expertise was inherently suspect. "Problem with civilians," she heard Torres explain to a new recruit, "is that they think expertise in one area translates to competence in everything else. A computer programmer thinks he can design tactical protocols. A competitive shooter thinks she understands operational requirements. University researchers think their theories apply to field conditions. They don't grasp that what we do requires a specific type of experience that can't be learned from books or simulated in controlled environments." The "she" in that statement caught Amanda's attention. Even hypothetically, Torres couldn't imagine a female civilian having relevant expertise. The layers of assumption were breathtaking. Not just that civilians were incompetent, but that women were particularly unsuited for tactical applications. As the week progressed, Amanda realized that her invisibility was about more than just being the food truck owner. She was dismissed along multiple dimensions: civilian, woman, small, foreign, service provider. Each category carried its own assumptions about capability and relevance. Combined, they created a wall of preconceptions that made her expertise literally unimaginable to the Rangers. But Amanda had been dealing with underestimation her entire life. She'd learned that the best response wasn't argument or demonstration. It was preparation. While others debated her limitations, she focused on developing capabilities. While they questioned her potential, she perfected her skills in private. The Rangers' assessment of civilian shooting expertise revealed more about their own limitations than about hers. They'd created such a narrow definition of relevant experience that they'd blinded themselves to possibilities that existed outside their institutional framework. Their confidence in their own methods had become intellectual arrogance that prevented them from recognizing excellence in unfamiliar forms. As Amanda cleaned her truck that evening, she reflected on how completely the Rangers had dismissed everything she represented. They saw her as fundamentally incapable of contributing to their world, not because of any demonstrated incompetence, but because of assumptions about who belonged in elite tactical circles. It was exactly the kind of thinking that created opportunities for people patient enough to wait for the right moment to prove assumptions wrong. Amanda had been patient for 8 months, learning everything she could while remaining invisible. But patience wasn't the same as passivity, and invisible wasn't the same as powerless. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now let's return to the narrative. What the Rangers didn't know was that Amanda's basement had been transformed into something that would have impressed their most demanding instructors. Hidden beneath her modest apartment on the outskirts of Colorado Springs was a shooting simulator that rivaled anything the military used for training. She'd spent 3 years and most of her savings creating a facility that could replicate virtually any shooting scenario imaginable. The centerpiece was a laser training system she'd imported from Germany, capable of projecting targets onto any surface with precision measured in millimeters. The system could simulate movement, varying light conditions, and environmental factors like wind resistance. More importantly, it could generate stress scenarios that pushed her beyond the comfortable predictability of traditional range shooting. Amanda's training regimen would have exhausted most professional marksmen. Every evening after closing her food truck, she descended into her basement laboratory and subjected herself to challenges that the Rangers had never encountered. She practiced shooting while her heart rate was elevated, while strobe lights disrupted her vision, while audio recordings of combat sounds filled her ears. She'd created a comprehensive program that addressed not just accuracy, but the psychological and physiological factors that separated good shooters from exceptional ones. Her equipment collection was museum quality. Rifles that cost more than most people's cars, precision optics that could resolve targets at distances the Rangers rarely attempted, ammunition loaded to specifications that competitive shooters guarded like state secrets. But the hardware was just the foundation. Amanda had spent years studying ballistics, wind patterns, elevation adjustments, and the mathematical relationships that govern precision shooting at extreme distances. The walls of her basement were covered with charts and graphs that documented her progress over thousands of hours of practice. She tracked not just accuracy, but consistency under varying conditions. She measured her performance when fatigued, stressed, cold, and operating with limited time. Her data collection was so comprehensive that she could predict her capability in virtually any scenario with mathematical precision. But Amanda's preparation extended far beyond technical skills. She'd made herself an expert on the Rangers' specific operational requirements. She studied their mission reports, analyzed their equipment choices, and understood the tactical challenges they faced better than most of their own officers. She knew which scenarios stressed their shooters most, where their training protocols had gaps, and how their capabilities compared to similar units nationwide. Her language studies were equally intensive. Amanda had taught herself the tactical vocabulary that Rangers used, memorized their communication protocols, and could speak their professional dialect fluently. She understood their ranking system, their operational procedures, and their institutional culture with the thoroughness of an anthropologist. When the moment came to demonstrate her competence, she wouldn't just have the skills, she'd speak their language fluently. The psychological preparation was perhaps most impressive of all. Amanda had developed mental conditioning techniques that allowed her to perform under pressure that would break most recreational shooters. She practiced visualization exercises, where she imagined herself in high-stakes scenarios, developed breathing techniques that could control her heart rate in stressful situations, and trained her mind to maintain focus despite external distractions. Her study of individual Rangers was particularly sophisticated. Over 8 months of observation, she developed detailed profiles of their shooting styles, their strengths and weaknesses, and their psychological patterns under pressure. She knew that Torres was technically proficient, but became conservative under stress. Davis was naturally gifted but relied too heavily on instinct instead of systematic technique. Coleman was consistent, but lacked the mental flexibility to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Amanda had even studied their equipment preferences and could predict how each Ranger would perform with different weapon systems. She understood their training philosophy well enough to anticipate how they'd react to demonstrations of unconventional techniques. Her preparation wasn't just about developing her own skills. It was about understanding exactly how to present those skills in ways that would force recognition from men predisposed to dismiss her. The physical conditioning was equally thorough. Amanda had transformed her body into an instrument capable of supporting precision shooting under any conditions. Her core strength allowed her to maintain stability in awkward positions. Her cardiovascular fitness meant she could control her breathing and heart rate, even when physically stressed. Her flexibility enabled shooting positions that most Rangers couldn't achieve. But perhaps most importantly, Amanda had developed the kind of mental toughness that separated professional operators from recreational enthusiasts. She'd trained herself to compartmentalize emotions, to function effectively when afraid, and to maintain technical precision when the stakes were highest. She'd created scenarios in her basement that simulated the psychological pressure of life-or-death decisions, preparing herself for moments when technical skill had to coexist with overwhelming stress. Her ammunition was hand-loaded to specifications that exceeded military standards. She'd spent hundreds of hours developing loads optimized for specific distances, weather conditions, and target types. Her powder charges were measured to the tenth of a grain, her bullets seeded to tolerances that required specialized equipment to achieve. The Rangers used good ammunition. Amanda used ammunition that was individually crafted for perfection. The training records she maintained were more detailed than anything the Rangers kept on their own personnel. She documented every shot, analyzed every miss, and identified patterns that revealed areas for improvement. Her basement contained 3 years of data that represented a level of self-analysis that most professional shooters never achieved. Amanda's preparation had a philosophical dimension that went beyond technical competence. She'd studied the mental game that separated good shooters from great ones, understanding that precision shooting was as much about psychology as ballistics. She'd learned to quiet her mind, to trust her training, and to perform complex tasks while under extreme stress. Most remarkably, she'd done all of this in complete isolation. While the Rangers trained as a team, with institutional support and professional instruction, Amanda had created her own curriculum and held herself to standards that exceeded anything they demanded of their personnel. Her discipline was self-imposed but absolute, her commitment total, despite having no official recognition or external validation. The Rangers saw a small woman who served coffee and made sandwiches. What they couldn't see was someone who dedicated her life to achieving a level of precision shooting excellence that few people in the world could match. Amanda had prepared for an opportunity that didn't yet exist, developing capabilities that had no outlet, driven by a vision of what she might accomplish if circumstances ever aligned with her abilities. As she completed another evening training session, Amanda reflected on the irony of her situation. She possessed skills that would have made her invaluable to any elite unit, but those skills remained hidden because the people who might recognize their value couldn't imagine them existing in someone like her. Her preparation was complete. Now she needed only the chance to demonstrate what she'd accomplished. The pattern of exclusion became increasingly obvious once Amanda started paying attention to it. What she'd initially dismissed as simple oversight revealed itself as something more systematic, a consistent failure to see her as anything more than a service provider whose thoughts and opinions were irrelevant to the serious business of law enforcement. The first incident that opened her eyes occurred during an equipment malfunction discussion. One of the Rangers' precision rifles had been producing inconsistent groupings, and several officers were debating potential causes while waiting for their morning coffee. Amanda listened to their theories with growing frustration, recognizing immediately that they were overlooking the most obvious explanation. Could be the scope mounts, Davis was suggesting. Sometimes the torque specifications aren't followed precisely during reassembly. Or ammunition variations, Coleman added. We switched suppliers last month. Different lot numbers can produce different velocities. Amanda knew from their description that the problem was almost certainly a crown issue, microscopic damage to the rifle's muzzle that would cause bullets to leave the barrel inconsistently. It was a common problem that could be diagnosed in minutes with the right technique. But the Rangers were pursuing more complex explanations because they assumed equipment problems required complex solutions. She stepped forward slightly, intending to offer her observation, but Torres cut off the discussion before she could speak. We'll have the armorer look at it when he comes in next week, he decided. No point in speculating when we can get a professional opinion. Amanda stepped back, her insight dismissed before she could even voice it. The message was clear. When technical problems needed solving, the Rangers would consult professionals, and she wasn't one of them. Her 8 months of observation, her obvious familiarity with firearms, her demonstrated attention to detail, none of it qualified her to contribute to their discussion. The exclusion pattern repeated itself in various forms over the following weeks. During a discussion about training modifications, Amanda overheard Rangers debating techniques she'd studied extensively. She could have provided insights that would have improved their approach, but her presence in their conversations was purely functional. They acknowledged her only when placing orders or requesting specific items. More telling was what happened when actual experts visited the facility. Amanda watched how the Rangers interacted with ballistics specialists, equipment manufacturers, and training consultants. Even when these outsiders offered suggestions the Rangers disagreed with, they were treated with professional respect. Their credentials earned them a hearing, even if their recommendations were ultimately rejected. Amanda possessed knowledge that exceeded many of these consultants, but she lacked the institutional credentials that would make her opinions worth considering. Her expertise was invisible because it existed outside the formal structures that the Rangers used to evaluate competence. She was trapped in a category, food service provider, that precluded being seen as technically knowledgeable. The exclusion extended to social interactions as well. When Rangers gathered informally around her truck, their conversations shifted to safe topics: weather, sports, generic complaints about administrative bureaucracy. The technical discussions, the operational planning, the professional development conversations all ceased when she was present. They weren't deliberately excluding her. They simply couldn't imagine that she might have relevant contributions to make. Amanda realized that her exclusion was reinforced by her own competence in her assigned role. Because she ran her food truck so professionally, because she was always prepared and never intrusive, she'd earned their respect as a service provider. But that respect was bounded by their assumptions about what service providers were capable of understanding. Her excellence in one role had trapped her in a narrow definition of her potential value. The most frustrating aspect was watching the Rangers struggle with challenges she could easily address. During one morning service, she overheard a discussion about long-range shooting techniques that revealed fundamental gaps in their understanding. They were applying principles correctly, but missing nuances that could significantly improve their performance. Amanda had spent years mastering exactly these techniques, but her expertise was irrelevant because they couldn't imagine her possessing it. The exclusion pattern became particularly obvious during equipment evaluations. When new gear arrived at the facility, Rangers would discuss its merits and limitations with detailed technical analysis. Amanda often knew more about the equipment than they did. She'd researched it extensively, read technical specifications, and understood its capabilities better than people who were seeing it for the first time. But she was never included in these discussions because her opinion hadn't been requested and wouldn't have been valued if offered. Even when Rangers made factual errors in their discussions, Amanda couldn't correct them without appearing presumptuous. She watched them reach wrong conclusions about ballistic coefficients, misunderstand scope adjustments, and apply outdated techniques because challenging their assumptions would have violated the unspoken boundaries of their relationship. Her role was to serve food, not to educate law enforcement professionals. The social dynamics were particularly revealing during shift changes. As Rangers came and went, their conversations flowed around Amanda as if she were part of the landscape. They discussed sensitive operational details, shared professional opinions, and debated policy changes without any consideration that she might be listening or that her discretion couldn't be assumed. Her invisibility was so complete that they forgot she was present, even when she was actively serving them. Amanda noticed that even positive interactions reinforced her exclusion. When Rangers complimented her food or thanked her for reliable service, their appreciation emphasized her competence within carefully defined limits. She was excellent at what she did, but what she did was fundamentally separate from what they did. Their praise reinforced the boundaries rather than challenging them. The pattern extended to assumptions about her interests and capabilities outside of food service. Rangers never asked about her hobbies, her background, or her other skills because they assumed she didn't have any that would interest them. Their casual friendliness masked a complete lack of curiosity about who she was beyond her functional role in their daily routine. Most painfully, Amanda realized that her exclusion was self-reinforcing. Because she was never asked for her opinions, she stopped offering them. Because her expertise was never acknowledged, she stopped displaying it. Because she was treated as functionally specialized, she began behaving as if that specialization defined her entire identity. The Rangers' assumptions about her limitations had started to shape her own behavior. But exclusion also created opportunities for observation. Because she was treated as invisible, Amanda could study the Rangers with an anthropologist's detachment. She learned their individual personalities, their professional strengths and weaknesses, their institutional blind spots. Her exclusion from their inner circle gave her an outsider's perspective that revealed patterns they couldn't see from within their own culture. As Amanda cleaned her truck at the end of another day, she reflected on how completely she'd been categorized and dismissed. The Rangers saw her as competent within narrow bounds but incapable of contributing to their core mission. They'd created a reality where her potential expertise simply didn't exist, because they couldn't imagine it existing in someone like her. But Amanda had learned patience from years of being underestimated. She understood that exclusion was often temporary, that circumstances could change, and that preparation combined with opportunity could overcome even the most entrenched assumptions. Her moment would come, she just had to be ready when it did. The frustration built slowly at first, like water rising behind a dam. Amanda had grown accustomed to being underestimated throughout her life. But 8 months of daily exclusion from conversations where she possessed superior knowledge was wearing away her patience. Every morning brought new instances of rangers struggling with problems she could solve, discussing techniques she'd mastered, and reaching conclusions she knew were wrong. The breaking point nearly came during a conversation about cold weather shooting techniques. Colorado's mountain environment created challenges that few rangers had experienced before joining the unit, and Amanda listened to them debate compensations for temperature effects on ballistics with growing incredulity. They were applying general principles correctly but missing specific adjustments that could mean the difference between success and failure in actual operations. Temperature affects powder burn rates, Davis was explaining to a group of newer rangers. Colder conditions slow the burn, which reduces velocity and changes your trajectory calculations. Right, Torres agreed. So you adjust your elevation settings to compensate for the velocity drop. Standard procedure. Amanda bit her tongue as she refilled coffee dispensers. What they were describing was textbook accurate, but incomplete. Temperature affected powder burn rates, but humidity, altitude, and barometric pressure created additional variables that required more sophisticated calculations. She'd spent months developing compensation formulas that accounted for all these factors simultaneously, techniques that could improve accuracy by significant margins in Colorado's challenging conditions. More frustrating was watching them struggle with equipment that she understood intimately. When one of their precision scopes began producing inconsistent results, Amanda recognized the symptoms immediately as a common problem with that particular model's adjustment mechanism. She'd encountered the same issue with her own equipment and knew exactly how to diagnose and correct it, but she watched them spend weeks troubleshooting unnecessarily because her knowledge was irrelevant to their process. The psychological toll was cumulative. Each day brought multiple instances of enforced silence, while rangers made preventable mistakes or missed opportunities for improvement. Amanda began to feel like an expert translator forced to watch miscommunication happen without being allowed to clarify meaning. Her expertise felt like a burden rather than an asset, valuable knowledge trapped by circumstances that prevented its application. Her evening training sessions became an outlet for mounting frustration. In her basement, Amanda pushed herself harder, seeking in solo practice the validation she couldn't find during her working hours. She created increasingly challenging scenarios that proved to herself what she couldn't prove to the rangers, that her skills were exceptional and her knowledge was comprehensive. But private validation felt hollow when her professional competence remained invisible to the people whose respect she craved. The frustration was compounded by awareness of how much she could contribute if given the chance. Amanda didn't just possess individual skills. She'd developed integrated approaches that could improve the rangers' overall effectiveness. Her understanding of ballistics, weather compensation, equipment optimization, and stress management formed a coherent system that addressed challenges the rangers faced regularly. But systems thinking required recognition as a knowledgeable contributor, not just a skilled service provider. Amanda found herself analyzing conversations with increasing intensity, identifying missed opportunities and flawed reasoning with the precision she applied to shooting. She began keeping mental notes of rangers' individual limitations, not from malice but from a desperate need to prove to herself that her observations had value. If she couldn't contribute directly, she could at least document how much her contributions might have mattered. The isolation was particularly difficult because Amanda had no outlet for discussing her professional interests. Her knowledge existed in a vacuum, developed through solitary study and individual practice. She'd created expertise that had no social context, skills that couldn't be shared or validated through normal professional interactions. The rangers represented her only contact with people who might understand what she'd accomplished, but they saw her as fundamentally incapable of understanding what they did. Sleep began to suffer as Amanda's mind replayed daily instances of exclusion and missed opportunity. She'd lie awake reconstructing conversations where she could have provided valuable insights, imagining how discussions might have proceeded if her knowledge had been acknowledged. The gap between her actual capabilities and others' perceptions of them created a persistent psychological tension that affected her overall well-being. Her relationship with the food truck business began to shift as well. What had once felt like a stepping stone toward future opportunities now felt like a trap that reinforced limiting assumptions about her potential. Success in food service was becoming an obstacle to recognition of her other capabilities. She was too good at what she did to be seen as capable of doing anything else. Amanda started making subtle attempts to display her knowledge without violating social boundaries. She'd mention reading articles about ballistics in ways that might prompt questions about her interests. She'd reference technical details in casual conversation that demonstrated familiarity with Ranger's professional concerns. But these hints were consistently ignored or deflected, as if acknowledgement of her expertise would somehow violate the natural order of their relationship. The most painful aspect was recognizing how completely the Rangers had accepted her limitations as natural and permanent. They weren't actively rejecting her potential contributions. They genuinely couldn't conceive of her having any. Their dismissal wasn't malicious. It was unconscious, which made it impossible to address directly. Amanda couldn't argue against assumptions they didn't realize they were making. Her frustration began affecting her service quality in subtle ways. Orders took slightly longer to process as her attention drifted to overheard conversations. Her usual cheerful efficiency was replaced by professional competence that lacked its previous warmth. The Rangers noticed these changes but attributed them to normal variations in mood rather than growing professional dissatisfaction. Amanda realized that her situation was unsustainable. She couldn't continue indefinitely as a passive observer of problems she could solve, techniques she could improve, and knowledge she could share. Her expertise was becoming psychologically burdensome because it had no outlet for expression. She needed either recognition of her capabilities or a change in circumstances that would allow her to use them elsewhere. But change seemed impossible given the depth of assumptions that surrounded her role. The Rangers' perceptions weren't based on evaluation of her potential. They were based on categorical thinking that precluded evaluation. She was trapped in a definition of herself that bore no relationship to her actual capabilities, constrained by others' mental models that she had no power to modify. As Amanda closed her truck another evening, watching Rangers head home after a day of training that could have been more effective with her input, she felt the weight of wasted potential. Her knowledge was comprehensive, her skills were exceptional, and her desire to contribute was genuine. But none of that mattered because the people who might benefit from her expertise couldn't imagine her possessing it. The frustration was no longer just personal, it was philosophical. Amanda was confronting the broader question of how competence was recognized and validated in professional contexts. She'd assumed that excellence would eventually be noticed and rewarded, but she was learning that excellence without proper credentialing or social positioning might remain invisible indefinitely. Her basement training that night was particularly intense, driven by the need to prove to herself that her skills remained sharp despite their lack of recognition. But even exceptional performance in private felt insufficient. Amanda needed validation that came from successfully contributing to something that mattered, from having her expertise acknowledged by people whose judgment she respected. The question was no longer whether she deserved recognition, it was whether circumstances would ever align to provide opportunities for demonstration. Amanda was prepared, frustrated, and increasingly determined to find ways to prove that assumptions about her limitations were wrong. She just needed the right moment to make her case. The shift in atmosphere was subtle at first, so gradual that Amanda almost missed it. What began as casual curiosity about her background slowly transformed into something that felt uncomfortably like suspicion. The change started with Captain Torres asking seemingly innocent questions that lingered just a moment too long, his eyes studying her face, as if searching for tells that might reveal hidden motives. "Walker," he said one morning while ordering his usual black coffee, "you never mentioned what you did before starting the food truck business. Most people don't just wake up one day and decide to serve breakfast to law enforcement." Amanda maintained her professional smile while internally calibrating her response. She'd prepared for this question but hadn't expected it to carry undertones of interrogation. "I worked in restaurants back in Austria," she replied truthfully. "Always wanted to own my own business. The food truck seemed like a good way to start small and build up." Torres nodded, but his expression suggested he was processing more than her words. "Austria, right? That's where you learned to speak English so well?" Started learning in school, improved at working in tourist areas, Amanda answered, recognizing that her linguistic competence had somehow become suspect rather than impressive. Her fluency, which should have been an asset, was being reframed as potentially deceptive. The scrutiny intensified when Ranger Davis began paying closer attention to her routine. She noticed him watching her setup process with the kind of systematic observation usually reserved for surveillance subjects. Her efficient organization, her precise timing, her comprehensive preparation for various scenarios, all qualities that had previously earned casual approval, were now being studied as if they might reveal concerning patterns. "You're pretty organized," Davis commented one morning, watching her arrange supplies with military-like precision. "Almost like you've had professional training in logistics or something." Amanda felt the trap embedded in the compliment. Acknowledging her organizational skills too enthusiastically might raise questions about where she'd developed them. Deflecting might seem suspicious in a different way. She opted for modest honesty. "I just like being prepared. Comes from growing up on a farm where you learn to plan ahead or deal with problems." But Davis's expression suggested that her explanation raised more questions than it answered. Her competence was being reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion that transformed assets into potential liabilities. The very qualities that made her good at her job were now being seen as possibly indicative of training or experience she hadn't disclosed. The questioning became more systematic when Coleman joined the unofficial investigation. His approach was different, less direct but more comprehensive. He began asking about her schedule, her living situation, her social connections, in ways that felt like intelligence gathering rather than friendly conversation. "Must be quiet living alone," he mentioned casually, while she prepared his breakfast burrito. "Bet you get plenty of time to pursue hobbies, read, maybe practice some skills from back home." Amanda recognized the fishing expedition, but couldn't avoid responding without seeming evasive. "I keep busy," she said carefully. "Still learning about American business practices, studying English, trying to understand local customs." Coleman's smile didn't reach his eyes. "What kind of studying? Books, online courses, maybe practical application of some kind?" The conversation felt like a gentle interrogation disguised as small talk. Amanda realized that her privacy, which she'd carefully maintained to protect her secret training, was being interpreted as suspicious concealment. Her deliberate discretion about her personal life had triggered exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd hoped to avoid. The scrutiny reached a new level when Amanda overheard Rangers discussing her among themselves. She was restocking supplies when their conversation drifted from the equipment shed, their voices carrying clearly in the mountain air. "There's something about Walker that doesn't add up," Torres was saying. "She's too competent, too prepared, too knowledgeable about things that aren't really her business." "What do you mean?" Davis asked, though his tone suggested he shared similar concerns. "She pays attention to everything: equipment discussions, training schedules, tactical procedures. Most civilians tune out when we talk shop, but she listens to every word. Sometimes I catch her watching our operations with the kind of focus that makes me wonder what she's really doing here." Amanda felt cold dread settling in her stomach. Her intellectual curiosity, her genuine interest in their profession, her efforts to understand their world, all of it was being reframed as potential surveillance or intelligence gathering. Her attention to detail was being seen as suspicious rather than professional. "Could be innocent," Coleman suggested, but without conviction. "Maybe she's just naturally curious about law enforcement. Some people are fascinated by what we do." "Maybe," Torres replied. "But curious about what, exactly? She asks questions about our equipment that most civilians wouldn't think of. She knows terminology that suggests more familiarity with tactical operations than you'd expect from someone serving breakfast." The conversation continued, but Amanda had heard enough. Her months of careful observation, her efforts to understand their profession, her genuine respect for their expertise, all of it was being interpreted through a framework of suspicion that transformed innocent behavior into potential threats. The psychological impact was devastating. Amanda realized that the same qualities that made her an expert in precision shooting, attention to detail, systematic observation, comprehensive preparation, were exactly the qualities that had aroused suspicion about her motives. Her competence had become evidence against her character. More disturbing was the recognition that she couldn't defend herself without revealing exactly the kind of hidden capabilities that would confirm their worst suspicions. If she disclosed her shooting expertise, her extensive equipment collection, her detailed knowledge of their operations. She'd be validating every concern they'd expressed about her secretive behavior and unexplained competence. The scrutiny began affecting her daily routine in subtle but significant ways. Rangers who had previously been friendly became professionally polite. Conversations that had once flowed naturally now felt stilted and carefully controlled. Her presence, which had once been welcomed as a convenient service, now felt tolerated with underlying tension. Amanda found herself second-guessing every interaction, analyzing her own behavior for signs that might be misinterpreted. Her natural efficiency was being seen as possibly suspicious. Her knowledge of their schedules and preferences, once appreciated as good customer service, was now viewed as potentially concerning surveillance. The irony was profound. Amanda's genuine admiration for the Rangers, her desire to understand and potentially contribute to their mission, had been transformed into evidence of hidden agendas and undisclosed motives. Her respect for their expertise was being interpreted as intelligence gathering. Her professional competence was being seen as concealment of true capabilities. Most painful was the realization that her months of patient observation had indeed given her detailed knowledge of their operations, individual personalities, and institutional vulnerabilities. The Ranger's suspicions weren't entirely wrong. She did know more about them than any civilian should, but she'd acquired that knowledge from genuine interest and professional admiration, not from any desire to exploit or compromise their security. As Amanda drove home that evening, she understood that her situation had become untenable. She couldn't continue operating under a cloud of suspicion that was likely to intensify rather than dissipate. Her cover as an innocent food truck owner had been compromised by the very competence she'd been trying to conceal. The scrutiny had revealed a fundamental problem with her approach. She'd assumed she could remain invisible while developing expertise, but competence inevitably attracted attention. Her skills had grown too sophisticated to hide, her knowledge too comprehensive to disguise, her capabilities too obvious to ignore. Amanda faced a choice between retreat and revelation. She could abandon her position, move away, and start over somewhere else where her capabilities wouldn't threaten existing assumptions. Or she could find a way to demonstrate that her expertise was an asset rather than a threat, that her hidden preparation had been motivated by service rather than subversion. The decision would have to be made soon. The Ranger's suspicion was crystallizing into something more systematic and potentially more dangerous. Amanda's window for controlling the narrative about her capabilities was closing rapidly. She needed an opportunity to prove that her secrets were about competence, not conspiracy, and she needed it before their scrutiny transformed into active investigation. The confrontation Amanda had been dreading came on a Thursday morning when Captain Torres requested a private meeting after the morning rush. His tone was professional, but carried an edge that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. Instead of their usual casual interaction around the food truck, he asked her to step into the facility's visitor conference room, a sterile space that transformed their relationship from friendly commercial transaction to formal interrogation. "Ms. Walker," Torres began, his use of her surname immediately establishing distance where first names had previously been the norm. "I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your presence at this facility." Amanda sat across from him at the metal conference table, maintaining steady eye contact while her mind raced through potential responses. She'd prepared for this moment, but hoped it would never come. "What kind of concerns?" she asked, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. "Multiple personnel have noticed that your level of interest in our operations extends beyond what we'd normally expect from a food service contractor," Torres continued, consulting notes he'd apparently prepared in advance. "Your questions about our equipment, your detailed knowledge of our training schedules, your apparent familiarity with tactical terminology, these things have created questions about your actual role here." The careful phrasing revealed how thoroughly he'd thought through this conversation. Torres wasn't making accusations. He was presenting observations and allowing her to provide explanations. But the underlying message was clear. Her behavior had been cataloged, analyzed, and found wanting. "I've always been interested in learning about my customers," Amanda replied carefully. "Understanding your work helps me provide better service. If I know your schedules, I can be better prepared. If I understand your equipment needs, I can stock appropriate supplies." Torres nodded as if expecting this response. "That's a reasonable explanation for casual interest. but several officers have reported that your knowledge goes beyond customer service requirements. You've demonstrated familiarity with ballistic concepts, tactical procedures, and operational details that suggest either professional background or systematic study that you haven't disclosed." Amanda felt the walls closing in. Her months of careful preparation, her genuine desire to understand their profession, her intellectual curiosity about their expertise, all of it was being reframed as evidence of deception or hidden agendas. She couldn't deny the observations without lying, but confirming them would raise even more serious questions. "I read a lot," she said, which was truthful but incomplete. "I've always been curious about different professions. When you work around law enforcement, you naturally pick up some terminology and basic concepts." "Ms. Walker," Torres interrupted gently but firmly, "we've had food service contractors for years. None of them developed the level of technical knowledge you've displayed. None of them asked the kinds of questions you ask or showed the kind of systematic interest in our operations that you've shown." Quote, "The comparison to previous contractors was devastating because it was accurate." Amanda had been different from the beginning, driven by interests that went far beyond commercial necessity. Her passion for precision shooting, her respect for the Rangers' expertise, her desire to understand their world, none of it could be explained by normal business relationships. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Amanda asked, deciding that direct confrontation might be more effective than continued deflection. Torres leaned back in his chair, studying her with the analytical attention she'd watched him apply to tactical problems. "I'm not suggesting anything specific, but I am telling you that your current level of engagement with our operations needs to change. Whatever your motivations, curiosity, professional interest, or something else, you need to limit your focus to food service functions." The ultimatum was delivered in calm, professional tones that made it impossible to argue against without seeming unreasonable. Torres wasn't being hostile. He was being clear about boundaries that Amanda had apparently crossed without realizing it. "From this point forward," he continued, "I need you to confine your activities to strictly commercial functions. No questions about our equipment, no discussions of tactical procedures, no demonstrations of knowledge about subjects outside your professional scope. Can you agree to those terms?" Amanda felt something cold settle in her chest. Torres was essentially asking her to lobotomize herself, to pretend ignorance about subjects she'd studied for years, to suppress the intellectual curiosity that made her interactions with the Rangers meaningful rather than purely transactional. "What if I have legitimate business reasons for needing information?" she asked. "Equipment preferences for supply planning, schedule changes that affect my service times, operational requirements that impact my preparation?" "Those discussions will go through official channels," Torres replied. "Direct your questions to the appropriate administrative personnel rather than operational staff. Keep your interactions with Rangers focused on immediate service needs." The bureaucratization of their relationship felt like a professional death sentence. Amanda was being demoted from valued service provider to barely tolerated vendor, stripped of the informal connections that had made her work satisfying despite its limitations. "Captain Torres," Amanda said, choosing her words carefully, "I understand your concerns, but I think there may be some misunderstanding about my motivations. My interest in your work comes from genuine respect and admiration, not from any hidden agenda." Torres's expression softened slightly, suggesting that he didn't personally dislike her but was responding to institutional pressures that left him no choice. "Ms. Walker, I don't doubt your sincerity, but the nature of our work requires us to be cautious about security issues. Your level of knowledge and interest, however innocent, creates vulnerabilities that we can't ignore." The word vulnerabilities stung because it transformed her greatest strength, her comprehensive understanding of their operations, into her greatest liability. Everything she'd learned out of respect and admiration was now being seen as potential security compromise. "What happens if I can't agree to these limitations?" Amanda asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Then we'll need to terminate our service contract and find another food provider," Torres replied without hesitation. "I'm sorry it's come to this, but the security of our operations takes precedence over convenience or personal relationships." Amanda sat in silence for a moment, processing the choice she was being offered. She could accept intellectual lobotomy and continue serving coffee while pretending ignorance about subjects she'd mastered. Or she could maintain her integrity and lose access to the professional environment that had become central to her life. Neither option addressed the fundamental problem. Amanda possessed expertise that had no legitimate outlet for expression. Her knowledge existed in a professional vacuum where it couldn't be shared, validated, or applied to useful purposes. The Rangers' ultimatum didn't solve this problem. It simply made it invisible again. "I need to think about this," Amanda said finally. Torres nodded understandingly. "Take whatever time you need, but understand that continued service requires acceptance of these boundaries. We can't compromise operational security for commercial convenience." As Amanda walked back to her truck, she realized that Torres had inadvertently revealed the depth of her knowledge about their operations. His concern about vulnerabilities confirmed that she'd indeed learned enough to potentially compromise their security, not because she intended to, but because she'd been so successful at understanding their world from the outside. The confrontation had clarified her situation with brutal honesty. She could remain as a neutered service provider, stripped of the intellectual engagement that made her work meaningful, or she could leave and find somewhere else to apply her capabilities. But staying meant accepting permanent limitation, and leaving meant abandoning the only professional environment where her skills might someday be recognized. Amanda spent the afternoon serving coffee and sandwiches while maintaining the cheerful professionalism that had defined her service for 8 months. But internally, she was calculating possibilities and probabilities with the same precision she applied to long-range shooting. Torres had given her an ultimatum, but he'd also revealed how much her capabilities worried them. Perhaps it was time to show them exactly what they should be worried about, not because she posed a threat, but because they were wasting an asset they didn't know they had. The confrontation had closed one door, but it might have opened another. Amanda just needed to find the courage to walk through it. The emergency call came in at 11:47 a.m. on a Friday that had started like any other. Amanda was cleaning her grill when the facility's alarm system shattered the mountain quiet with its urgent electronic wail. Through the food truck's windows, she watched Rangers sprint toward the command center, their casual morning routine instantly transformed into the controlled chaos of emergency response. Within minutes, the facility buzzed with activity that Amanda had never witnessed before. Helicopters appeared on the horizon, their rotors thundering across the valley as they approached the landing pad. Emergency vehicles streamed through the facility's gates, and personnel who normally worked in office buildings emerged wearing tactical gear that suggested the situation was serious enough to mobilize every available resource. Amanda moved closer to the command center, ostensibly to clean the exterior of her truck but actually to gather information about what was happening. The fragments of radio chatter she caught were alarming. Multiple hostages, armed suspects, remote location, and most chillingly, sniper threat confirmed. Quote, Captain Torres emerged from the command center looking grim, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with what sounded like federal agencies. Amanda caught enough of his conversation to understand that a domestic terrorist group had taken hostages at a remote mountain research facility, and that the situation required precision capabilities that pushed the limits of what even elite rangers could accomplish. Distance is the problem, Torres was saying into his phone. We're looking at shots beyond our normal operational parameters. The terrain gives the suspects commanding views of all approach routes, and our standard marksmen can't engage effectively from safe positions. Amanda felt her pulse quicken as she processed the tactical implications. A sniper situation in mountain terrain at extended range. Exactly the kind of scenario she'd been training for obsessively. Her basement simulator had prepared her for this specific combination of challenges. Long-distance precision shooting under stress, with innocent lives hanging in the balance. More details emerged as Rangers gathered near the command center for emergency briefing. The terrorist group had fortified positions at a research station located on a narrow mountain ridge, with hostages held in a building that could only be approached through exposed terrain. The suspects included at least one trained marksman who had already demonstrated ability to engage targets at distances that made conventional assault tactics suicidal. Amanda listened to the tactical discussion with growing recognition that this situation played to every one of her strengths. The extended range that intimidated the Rangers was well within her comfort zone. The mountain environment was similar to terrain she'd studied extensively. The precision requirements that made other marksmen nervous were exactly what she'd been preparing for during thousands of hours of basement training. "We need someone who can make shots at 800 meters under field conditions," she heard Davis tell another ranger. "In this terrain, with wind conditions changing constantly, that's beyond what most of our people can do reliably." 800 meters. Amanda almost smiled, despite the gravity of the situation. Amanda stood there for a moment, watching the Rangers return to their tactical planning while dismissing her offer without any evaluation of its merit. They were so certain of her limitations that they wouldn't even consider the possibility that their assumptions might be wrong. As she walked back toward her food truck, Amanda understood that she faced the same choice that had confronted her during the equipment debates and training discussions. She could accept their dismissal and watch preventable tragedies unfold, or she could find a way to demonstrate capabilities they refused to acknowledge. But this time, the stakes weren't professional recognition or personal validation. This time, people were going to die while Amanda stood by with skills that could save them, simply because those skills existed in a package the Rangers couldn't recognize as legitimate. The question was no longer whether she deserved recognition for her expertise. The question was whether she could live with herself if she remained silent, while possessing capabilities that might prevent needless deaths. Amanda had spent 8 months being invisible. Perhaps it was time to become impossible to ignore. Amanda stood beside her food truck, watching the Rangers coordinate with federal agencies while precious minutes slipped away. Their radio chatter revealed the stark reality of their situation. Professional sniper teams were still hours away. The hostage takers had issued ultimatums that wouldn't accommodate bureaucratic response times. And people were going to die while perfectly adequate solutions were dismissed because they came from an unrecognized source. The moral calculus was brutal in its clarity. Amanda possessed capabilities that could resolve this crisis, but those capabilities remained invisible because they existed in someone the Rangers had categorized as fundamentally incapable of possessing them. She could follow orders, remain in her assigned role, and watch preventable tragedies unfold. Or she could violate every boundary they'd established and prove that their assumptions about her limitations were wrong. The decision crystallized as she heard Torres inform federal coordinators that local resources were insufficient for the tactical requirements. "We need military-level precision shooting capabilities," he was saying into his radio. "Our personnel are competent, but this situation requires expertise beyond our normal operational parameters." Amanda walked to her truck and unlocked the storage compartment where she kept her personal belongings. Hidden beneath legitimate business supplies was a range bag that contained equipment worth more than most Rangers made in 6 months. Custom-loaded ammunition, precision optics, and ballistic calculators that represented years of careful acquisition and thousands of hours of training. Her hands were steady as she assembled gear that transformed her from food service provider into something the Rangers hadn't imagined possible. The precision rifle she'd brought that morning was a masterpiece of German engineering, capable of delivering bullets with accuracy measured in fractions of inches at distances that intimidated professional marksmen. More importantly, she'd trained with this specific weapon system until operating it became as natural as breathing. Amanda's phone contained ballistic applications that could calculate trajectory adjustments for any environmental condition. Her rangefinder could measure distances with laser precision. Her shooting journal documented performance under conditions that replicated exactly what this crisis demanded. She'd prepared for this moment without knowing it was coming, developing capabilities that no one suspected and few could match. The walk to the facility's perimeter fence felt like crossing a bridge she could never return over. With each step, Amanda was violating protocols, ignoring direct orders, and confirming every suspicion the Rangers had developed about her secretive behavior and undisclosed capabilities. But she was also moving toward the possibility of saving lives that would otherwise be lost to bureaucratic assumptions and institutional inflexibility. The fence presented a minor obstacle that her climbing skills handled easily. Amanda had studied the facility's security extensively during her months of service, understanding its layout well enough to navigate around surveillance systems and access routes. Her knowledge of their operations, previously seen as suspicious, now became tactically valuable as she positioned herself for maximum effectiveness. The mountain terrain beyond the facility provided exactly the kind of shooting position she'd trained for obsessively. Amanda found a ridge that offered clear lines of sight to the hostage situation, while remaining concealed from both the terrorists and the Rangers, who would certainly try to stop her if they discovered her unauthorized intervention. Setting up her shooting position felt like the culmination of years of preparation. Every piece of equipment had been selected and tested for exactly this kind of scenario. Every technique she employed had been practiced thousands of times until it became muscle memory. Amanda was no longer the food truck owner who served coffee and was told to stay in her lane. She was a precision marksman preparing to engage targets under conditions that would challenge the world's elite shooters. Her communication intercept equipment allowed her to monitor Ranger radio traffic and understand the tactical situation as it developed. The hostage-takers had positioned themselves with professional competence, creating fields of fire that dominated all conventional approach routes. Their sniper was engaging Ranger reconnaissance teams at distances that confirmed he possessed genuine expertise rather than amateur enthusiasm. Amanda's ballistic calculations accounted for every environmental variable that might affect bullet trajectory at 800 meters. Wind speed and direction, air density, temperature gradients, and elevation differences were all factored into firing solutions that would deliver bullets with surgical precision. Her equipment and training had prepared her for exactly these challenges. The moral weight of her decision was enormous. Amanda was acting without authorization, violating explicit orders, and taking responsibility for outcomes that could result in multiple deaths if she failed. But she was also the only person in position with capabilities adequate to resolve a crisis that would otherwise end in preventable tragedy. Her phone contained contact information for Captain Torres, but she hesitated before making the call that would announce her unauthorized intervention. Once she revealed her position and capabilities, there would be no retreat from the consequences of her actions. The Rangers would have to choose between accepting help from someone they'd dismissed or watching her operate independently while they maintained their institutional assumptions. Amanda decided to demonstrate first and explain later. Her shooting position was optimal, her equipment was perfectly calibrated, and her skills were at their peak. She would engage the terrorist sniper, neutralize the threat that paralyzed Ranger tactical options, and force recognition of capabilities they'd refused to acknowledge through any other means. The radio traffic revealed that Rangers were preparing for a desperate assault that would likely result in multiple casualties among both hostages and law enforcement personnel. Their conventional tactics were inadequate for the situation they faced, but they were proceeding because waiting for appropriate resources meant accepting certain death for the hostages. Amanda keyed her radio to the Rangers' tactical frequency, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to announce. "Command, this is Walker. I have the hostile sniper in my sights and am prepared to engage. Recommend you delay assault until I can neutralize the Overwatch threat." The response was immediate and predictable. Torres's voice crackled through her earpiece with a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. "Walker, what the hell are you doing? Get off this frequency and return to base immediately. You are not authorized for any tactical operations." "Captain Torres," Amanda replied, adjusting her scope's elevation settings for the confirmed range to target. "I have 800 meters to a hostile sniper who's preventing your assault teams from effectively engaging. I can eliminate this threat and create the tactical opening you need to save the hostages." "Amanda, you need to understand that what you're suggesting is impossible," Torres responded, his voice carrying the strain of someone dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. "You don't have the training, equipment, or authorization for tactical shooting. Return to base immediately before you get yourself or someone else killed." Amanda smiled grimly as she settled into her final shooting position. Her crosshairs centered on a target who had no idea he was about to be engaged by someone whose existence he couldn't have imagined. "Captain Torres, I understand you don't believe I'm capable of this. In about 30 seconds, I'm going to prove that your assumptions about my limitations were wrong." The hostile sniper was positioned behind cover that protected him from Ranger positions, but left him exposed to Amanda's elevated angle of attack. Her ballistic solution was perfect, environmental conditions were stable, and her equipment was performing flawlessly. Everything she'd trained for was about to be tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Amanda's breathing slowed to the rhythm she'd practiced thousands of times. Her trigger finger took up slack with the precision of a surgeon making a critical incision. The hostile sniper filled her scope's reticle, unaware that his tactical advantage was about to be eliminated by someone whose expertise had been dismissed as impossible. "Engaging now," Amanda whispered into her radio, and squeezed the trigger with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. The rifle's recoil was absorbed perfectly by Amanda's shooting position, her body mechanics honed through thousands of repetitions until the weapon's kick felt like an extension of her own heartbeat. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's trajectory unfold in slow motion, a perfect arc spanning 800 meters of Colorado mountain air, accounting for wind drift, elevation drop, and atmospheric conditions that would have challenged the world's elite marksmen. The hostile sniper's head snapped back as the precision-loaded .308 round found its mark with surgical accuracy. Amanda's shot had been placed with mathematical precision, calculated to neutralize the threat instantly while minimizing any risk to the hostages positioned in the building below. Years of basement training, thousands of dollars in equipment, and obsessive preparation had culminated in a single moment of flawless execution. "Target down," Amanda reported into her radio, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished. "Hostile sniper eliminated. Your assault teams now have clear approach routes from the north and east vectors." The radio silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in tactical operations where every moment could mean the difference between life and death. When Captain Torres finally responded, his voice carried a mixture of shock, disbelief, and the kind of professional recognition that Amanda had been seeking for 8 months. "Walker, did you just... How is that possible?" Torres stammered, his usual command presence shaken by witnessing something that contradicted every assumption he'd made about Amanda's capabilities. "I told you I could make the shot," Amanda replied, already adjusting her position to provide overwatch for the Ranger assault teams. "I have visual on 3 additional hostiles in the main building. 2 are armed with rifles, 1 appears to have explosives. I can provide precision fire support for your breach if you can coordinate your approach with my position." The transformation in radio communications was immediate and profound. Torres's voice shifted from incredulous disbelief to professional respect as he began treating Amanda as a tactical asset rather than a delusional civilian. "Walker, what's your current position and field of view? We need to coordinate our assault with your overwatch capabilities." Amanda provided detailed intelligence about hostile positions, building layout, and tactical opportunities that only someone with her elevated vantage point could observe. Her months of studying Ranger procedures allowed her to communicate in their professional vocabulary, providing information in formats that could be immediately integrated into their operational planning. "Command, I have clear shots on both rifle-armed hostiles," Amanda reported, tracking targets through her scope with the fluid precision of a professional marksman. "I can eliminate both threats simultaneously if your breach team is prepared to move immediately afterward." The coordination that followed felt like the culmination of Amanda's secret preparation. Every technique she'd developed, every piece of equipment she'd acquired, every skill she'd practiced, was being applied to save lives in exactly the kind of scenario she'd trained for obsessively. The Rangers were no longer dismissing her expertise, they were depending on it. "Walker, we're in position," Torres confirmed. "On your signal, eliminate both targets. Breach team will move immediately after your shots." Amanda's breathing slowed to the meditative rhythm she'd perfected through years of precision shooting. Her first target filled the scope's reticle, unaware that his tactical advantage had already been eliminated by someone whose existence he couldn't have imagined. The crosshairs settled with mechanical precision as Amanda's finger took up trigger slack. The first shot was perfect, a precision strike that neutralized the threat instantly without endangering any hostages. Amanda's bolt manipulation was fluid and automatic, chambering her second round while adjusting her aim point for the remaining armed hostile. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, executed with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced this exact scenario hundreds of times. Her second shot was equally precise, eliminating the final rifle threat and creating the tactical opening that Ranger assault teams needed to breach the building safely. Through her scope, Amanda watched professional operators execute their assault with the confident precision that came from knowing their overwatch was provided by someone whose capabilities matched their own. "Both rifle targets eliminated," Amanda reported, continuing to scan for additional threats while Rangers cleared the building below. "No additional hostiles visible from my position. Hostages appear to be secured in the main room, northeast corner of the building." The assault proceeded with textbook efficiency, Rangers flowing through the building with the kind of coordinated precision that came from years of training and absolute confidence in their supporting elements. Amanda maintained overwatch throughout the operation, her scope tracking potential threat vectors while Rangers systematically cleared each room. "Building secure," Torres announced over the radio. "All hostages recovered safely, no Ranger casualties. Walker, your precision fire support was exceptional." The word exceptional carried weight that went far beyond simple acknowledgement. Amanda had not only demonstrated capabilities that the Rangers hadn't believed possible, she'd done so under the most demanding conditions imaginable, with innocent lives depending on her performance. Her shots had been perfect, her tactical coordination flawless, her professional competence undeniable. As Amanda began packing her equipment, she reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. 8 months of being dismissed, overlooked, and categorized as irrelevant had been overturned by 15 minutes of demonstrating what she was actually capable of accomplishing. The Rangers could no longer pretend that her expertise didn't exist or that her capabilities were somehow illegitimate. Her radio crackled with coordination traffic as Rangers secured the scene and prepared for post-operation procedures. But embedded in the professional communications was a new tone of respect that acknowledged Amanda as someone whose opinion mattered, whose capabilities were valued, whose contribution had been essential to mission success. The walk back to the facility felt different than any journey Amanda had taken during her 8 months of service. She was no longer the invisible food truck owner who served coffee, while real professionals handled important work. She was the marksman who'd made impossible shots under extreme pressure, who'd saved lives that would otherwise have been lost, who'd proven that expertise could exist in packages that institutional thinking couldn't recognize. Amanda knew that everything would be different now. The Rangers could no longer dismiss her as a civilian with delusions of competence. They'd witnessed firsthand what years of secret preparation could accomplish when applied by someone with genuine expertise and absolute determination. Her precision shooting had earned her something that months of patient service never could: recognition as someone whose capabilities matched her ambitions. The aftermath of the successful hostage rescue unfolded with the controlled chaos typical of post-operation procedures, but Amanda could sense that something fundamental had shifted in how the Rangers perceived her. As she descended from her shooting position, carrying equipment that represented years of secret preparation, she found herself walking into a completely transformed relationship with people who had dismissed her expertise just hours earlier. Captain Torres met her at the facility's perimeter, his expression mixing professional respect with something approaching amazement. Behind him stood Davis, Coleman, and several other Rangers who had witnessed her radio communications during the operation. Their faces reflected the kind of cognitive dissonance that came from having basic assumptions overturned by undeniable evidence. "Walker," Torres began, then paused as if searching for words adequate to the situation. "I owe you an apology and an explanation of how we could have been so wrong about your capabilities." Amanda shouldered her rifle case, noting how the Rangers' eyes tracked the expensive equipment with new understanding. What had previously been invisible to them, her technical knowledge, her professional competence, her serious commitment to precision shooting, was now impossible to ignore. "You weren't wrong to be cautious," Amanda replied diplomatically. "My background isn't what you expected, and I didn't make it easy for you to understand what I was capable of." Davis stepped forward, his expression reflecting genuine curiosity rather than the dismissive skepticism she'd grown accustomed to. "Amanda, those shots you made today, the precision, the timing, the tactical coordination, that's professional-level marksmanship. Where did you develop those capabilities?" Amanda had prepared for this question during her months of secret training, but she'd never expected to answer it under these circumstances. "I grew up on a farm in Austria where my grandfather taught me to shoot. I competed in regional championships as a teenager, was part of an Olympic development program before family circumstances changed my priorities." The revelation explained much but raised additional questions that she could see forming in their expressions. Torres voiced what they were all thinking, but that was years ago, and those were different conditions. What you demonstrated today required current, advanced training with professional-grade equipment. "I've been training continuously since I moved to Colorado," Amanda admitted. "I built a simulator in my basement, acquired military-grade equipment, and developed techniques specifically for mountain shooting. I've been preparing for scenarios exactly like today's situation." Coleman shook his head in amazement. "You've been serving us coffee for 8 months while maintaining capabilities that exceed most of our unit's marksmen. Why didn't you ever mention this background?" Amanda's smile was rueful. Would you have believed me, a food truck owner claiming to be an expert marksman? You'd have thought I was delusional or trying to impress you with exaggerated claims. The truth of her observation was written on their faces. They would indeed have dismissed such claims as civilian fantasy, just as they dismissed her offer to help during the crisis. Their assumptions about who could possess elite capabilities had blinded them to evidence that contradicted their institutional thinking. "The equipment you were using," Davis said, his professional curiosity overcoming his amazement, "that wasn't civilian hunting gear. That was precision shooting equipment that costs more than most people make in a year." "I've invested everything I had in developing these capabilities," Amanda confirmed. "The restaurant dreams, the business expansion plans, all of that went into equipment and training. I've been living like a monk for 3 years to afford the tools necessary for precision shooting at this level." Torres studied her with the analytical attention she'd watched him apply to tactical problems. "Amanda, what you accomplished today was extraordinary. But I need to understand something. Why did you develop these capabilities if you had no outlet for using them? What was your end goal?" The question went to the heart of what had driven Amanda through years of solitary preparation. "I wanted to be ready," she said simply. "I've always been underestimated because of my size, my gender, my background. I learned that the only way to overcome assumptions was to develop capabilities so exceptional that they couldn't be ignored when the right opportunity arose." "And you thought that opportunity might come from working around law enforcement?" Coleman asked. "I hoped it might," Amanda admitted. "I respected what you do, understood the challenges you face, and thought that maybe someday I could contribute something valuable. I just didn't expect it to happen like this." The Rangers exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their reassessment of Amanda's motivations and capabilities. What they'd interpreted as suspicious surveillance had actually been genuine professional interest and systematic preparation for exactly the kind of situation that had just unfolded. "The questions you asked, the knowledge you displayed, the familiarity with our procedures," Torres said, understanding dawning in his expression. "You were studying us to understand how you might fit into this world." "And preparing myself to contribute effectively if the opportunity arose," Amanda confirmed. "Every conversation, every observation, every piece of information I gathered was about understanding your needs well enough to someday meet them." Davis laughed, but this time with genuine amusement rather than dismissive skepticism. "So when we started getting suspicious about your technical knowledge and detailed attention to our operations, you were reacting to exactly the preparation that enabled me to save lives today," Amanda finished. "My secrecy about my capabilities made you suspicious, but revealing them earlier would have seemed like delusional bragging." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The Rangers' institutional caution had prevented them from recognizing an asset that could have been contributing to their mission for months. Their assumptions about civilian limitations had blinded them to expertise that exceeded their own unit's capabilities in critical areas. "Amanda," Torres said, his tone shifting to something approaching formality, "I need to ask you something important. After what happened today, after what you've demonstrated, would you be interested in discussing a more permanent arrangement? We have openings for civilian contractors with specialized capabilities, and your marksmanship skills are exactly what we need for high-risk operations." Amanda felt something settle in her chest that she'd been carrying without realizing it, the weight of having exceptional capabilities with no legitimate outlet for their application. The Rangers weren't just acknowledging her expertise. They were offering her the opportunity to use it in service of something that mattered. "I'd be very interested in that discussion," she said, unable to keep the relief and satisfaction from her voice. As they walked back toward the facility, Amanda reflected on how completely her situation had transformed. This morning, she'd been a dismissed food truck owner whose expertise was invisible to the people around her. Tonight, she was a recognized specialist whose capabilities had proven essential under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The Rangers had learned that assumptions about limitations could blind them to assets hiding in plain sight. Amanda had learned that patience combined with preparation could overcome any prejudice when circumstances created opportunities for demonstration. Sometimes being too small to matter meant being exactly the right size to make all the difference. 6 months later, Amanda Walker stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been invisible, but everything had changed. The Colorado Mountain Rangers patch on her shoulder identified her as Senior Precision Marksman, a civilian contractor position created specifically to utilize her exceptional capabilities. Her coffee-stained apron had been replaced by tactical gear that reflected her new status as one of the unit's most valuable assets. The target area presents significant challenges, Amanda told the assembled Rangers, pointing to topographical displays that she now helped create rather than secretly studied. Wind patterns in this valley create cross-currents that will affect bullet trajectory beyond 600 meters. I recommend positioning here and here, she indicated specific locations, to account for environmental variables and ensure clean shots if precision fire becomes necessary. Captain Torres nodded approvingly from his position at the front of the room. The man who had once questioned her motives now sought her input on every operation that might require long-range precision shooting. Their professional relationship had evolved into something approaching partnership, built on mutual respect and demonstrated competence. Walker's right about the wind patterns, Torres confirmed. Her ballistic analysis has improved our operational success rate by 40% since she joined the team. Any questions about positioning or equipment? The questions that followed reflected genuine professional curiosity rather than the dismissive skepticism Amanda had endured during her months as a food truck owner. Rangers who had once seen her as irrelevant now recognized her as possessing expertise that enhanced their own capabilities. Her technical knowledge was valued, her tactical insights were incorporated into planning, and her opinion carried weight in discussions about complex operations. Davis raised his hand from the back of the room. Amanda, for the newer personnel who haven't worked with you before, can you explain how civilian marksmanship training translates to tactical operations? Some of them might be wondering about the differences. The question would have been impossible 6 months ago when Davis had been one of her strongest critics. Now he was providing her with opportunities to educate Rangers about capabilities they might not fully understand. Amanda appreciated his support while recognizing how completely their dynamic had transformed. Competitive shooting teaches precision and consistency under pressure, Amanda explained, addressing the room with the confidence of someone whose expertise was no longer questioned. But tactical applications require additional skills, coordination with assault teams, target identification under stress, and shooting positions that prioritize concealment over comfort. I've had to adapt my competition background to meet operational requirements. The integration hadn't been seamless. Amanda had faced challenges, transitioning from solitary basement training to coordinated team operations. But the Rangers had supported her adaptation, providing tactical education while learning from her precision shooting expertise. The relationship had become genuinely collaborative rather than hierarchical. The most important difference, Amanda continued, is psychological. Competition shooting is about personal performance, but tactical shooting is about mission success. Every shot I take now affects team safety and operational outcomes. That responsibility requires a different mental approach than anything I learned in civilian competition. Coleman nodded from his position near the equipment displays. As Amanda's primary tactical coordinator, he'd developed genuine appreciation for her capabilities while helping her understand Ranger operational procedures. Their working relationship had evolved far beyond the polite dismissal that had characterized their previous interactions. Amanda's adaptation has been remarkable, Coleman added. She's developed tactical instincts that complement her technical skills. Her situational awareness during operations exceeds many personnel with years of field experience. The recognition felt surreal to Amanda, who remembered serving coffee to these same men while her expertise remained invisible. But the transformation was real and comprehensive. She was no longer the overlooked civilian trying to prove her worth. She was an integrated team member whose contributions were essential to mission success. The briefing concluded with operational assignments that reflected Amanda's new status. Instead of being excluded from important missions, she was now designated as primary marksman for the unit's most challenging operations. Her basement training had been validated by professional success that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. As Rangers dispersed to prepare for the upcoming operation, Torres approached Amanda with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal amazement. You know, Amanda, I still think about that first hostage situation. How different things might have been if I'd listened to your initial offer instead of dismissing it. Amanda's smile reflected both forgiveness and understanding. You made reasonable assumptions based on available information. I don't fault you for being cautious about operational security. But I nearly let prejudice prevent us from accessing capabilities we desperately needed, Torres replied. That's a leadership failure I won't repeat. Sometimes expertise comes in packages we don't expect. The conversation represented closure on months of mutual misunderstanding while acknowledging lessons that both had learned. Amanda's patience and preparation had been validated, while Torres had discovered that assumptions about limitations could blind leaders to valuable resources. The food truck is still parked outside, Torres mentioned with amusement. Rachel from logistics has been running it during operations, says she's thinking about buying it from you permanently. Amanda laughed at the suggestion. Her mobile restaurant had become someone else's opportunity while she pursued the career that had always been her true calling. The circular justice of the situation appealed to her sense of how things should work, everyone finding their proper niche based on actual capabilities rather than assumed limitations. "Tell Rachel she can have it," Amanda said. "I've found where I belong." As she prepared her equipment for the upcoming mission, Amanda reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible service provider to recognized specialist. The Rangers had learned that competence could exist in unexpected forms, while she'd proven that preparation combined with patience could overcome any assumption about limitations. Her radio crackled with coordination traffic for the upcoming operation. "Walker, confirm your ready status for precision overwatch." "Ready and standing by," Amanda replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone whose expertise was no longer questioned. The transformation was complete. Amanda Walker was no longer just a food truck owner who happened to be an exceptional marksman. She was Senior Precision Marksman Walker, a professional whose capabilities were essential to her team's success. The Rangers had discovered that assumptions about who could possess elite capabilities had blinded them to an asset hiding in plain sight. Sometimes being too small to matter meant being exactly the right size to make all the difference. And sometimes the best way to prove your worth was to be so prepared for opportunity that when it finally arrived, you couldn't be ignored. Amanda smiled as she checked her equipment one final time. She'd spent years being underestimated, but she'd used that invisibility to develop capabilities that no one suspected. When the moment came to prove herself, she'd been ready. The mission was beginning, and Amanda Walker, former food truck owner, current precision marksman, and permanent proof that expertise could exist anywhere, was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.